and it was like, look, this is it's here now. Hope they can eradicate it.
Welcome to Unearthed, the people changing Australian agriculture. I'm your host, Michael Thompson, and in this episode we're heading deep into the hives of Australia's honeybee industry to examine the threat of Varroa mite, as well as explore the AgriFutures Australia program that's now providing an early warning system to beekeepers to emerging threats to their hives and the crops that depend upon them. Each spring, a brilliant transformation of life takes place in the flowering almond orchards of South Australia and Victoria, which are inundated with billions of visiting honeybees. The bees aren't there by chance, they're there on purpose, with beekeepers travelling thousands of kilometres from across Australia to transport their hives to the region for pollination services. They bring some 135,000 beehives with them, each hive containing about 50,000 bees. That's more than 6 billion bees in total, without which a crop would not be harvested later in the season. Now imagine if some of those magnificent worker bees were being asked to carry an additional burden on their back, literally sucking the life from them as they worked. In human terms, being burdened with the Varroa destructor mite is akin to carrying a dinner plate-sized parasite on your abdomen, literally sucking the life out of you while you're trying to go about your business. Your ability to function declines until you slowly die, as do your friends and family, neighbours, and eventually your whole community.
But yeah, it was a shock, even though everyone had said it's a matter of when, not if. That conversation had been happening basically for the 21 years that I'd been beekeeping. It was a when, not if, and I guess the longer that goes, the bigger that if becomes.
That's Darryl Brenton, a fourth-generation beekeeper from Kempsey in New South Wales. In June 2022, his worst fears were realised when Varroa destructor mite was detected in sentinel hives at the port of Newcastle.
It was close, but it was a bit of a distance, and if people did the right thing, it was hopefully a chance of eradicating it. How long it had been there, we didn't know. We didn't know a real lot at that stage, but personally, I was hopeful that it could be eradicatable. But as things progressed, it was it found its way to Kempsey.
And then you actually got a phone call from one of your friends when it arrived,
yes.
didn't you?
Yeah, it was a guy who'd previously worked for me, and he rang me up one afternoon and said, guess what I've just found? And so through doing an alcohol wash in his own hives in the south side of Kempsey, he detected one Varroa mite, which was great of him to have done that. And obviously he did the right thing and immediately reported it.
He must have been in a bit of a state of shock of, suddenly he's right in the centre of the firestorm, and as are you too, yeah.
Yeah, he was, and he quickly understood the ramifications of that because there was quite a big beekeeping community in Kempsey, commercial and amateurs, and hobby beekeepers. So quite a lot of bees in Kempsey, and for it to have jumped from, it's not that far, but jumped from Newcastle to Kempsey somehow. We'd prefer that it didn't happen.
So what is it about Varroa destructor mite that is so deadly? Dr. Michael Holmes from the Australian National University explains why it gives beekeepers nightmares.
Varroa mite is what we call an ectoparasite. So it's a parasitic mite that lives on honeybees. It is an obligate parasite of honeybees, which means it can only live on honeybees. It doesn't have any other hosts. And the reason that Varroa is bad for bees is because as an ectoparasite, what that means is the mite attaches itself to the outside of the bee's body. It feeds on both larvae, pupae, and adult bees, and it feeds on the honeybee's fat body. So it feeds on the bee itself, and relatively speaking, Varroa mite is, if you project it out to the size of a human, it would be as if we had a mite the size of a dinner plate attached to our body, feeding on us. Yeah. And that's, obviously bad enough, but the really big problem with Varroa mites is that they are a vector for viruses, and they spread all kinds of deadly viruses throughout honeybee colonies, which is the major problem that they cause.
So when Varroa was first detected in June 2022, it sparked a multi-agency response from government and industry bodies with the initial goal of eradicating this unwanted visitor. At the front line of the action was Bianca Jiggins, the National Varroa Coordinator for the Australian Honeybee Industry Council.
The main aim at that point, and for quite a few months after, for nearly a year and a half, was to eradicate Varroa. It was a very challenging time. We had lots of friends affected, including myself, with the initial stages of the Varroa response, and also had lots of beekeepers coming from across the country to help to do lots of the surveillance that was required as well. So, look, it was a really, really challenging time.
Infected hives at the epicentre of the outbreak were destroyed, while nearby hives were quarantined and monitored, hitting the businesses of beekeepers like Daryl quite hard. He recalls just how quickly the operating landscape changed.
So I had one apiary which they detected mites in, and that apiary of 120 hives was euthanised within, I think, 2 or 3 days of that initial detection. So that happened quite quickly. And then there was a period of about 5 or 6 days where there wasn't a lot of communication. It was over a weekend, and then we realised that, or then we were informed that the two questions that the eradication process was dealing with was basically, is it technically feasible to continue to eradicate the mite, and is it cost beneficial? So once it became too hard and cost too much, then they had to move to transition to management.
Then in September 23, there was a shift in focus, moving away from eradication as the goal and onto containment and management. That program took on the name Transition to Management, or as it's called in the industry, T2M, and it had a very different set of messages for beekeepers.
Monitoring, looking, surveillance. So if you've already found Varroa, to continue monitoring regularly in order to keep your honeybee colonies healthy. There's also surveillance where you haven't found Varroa yet in different states. Definitely keep looking. Alcohol washing. So there's a lot of resources available to beekeepers to undertake their own surveillance activities. And we strongly encourage it. So we encourage all beekeepers, in those areas to continue to look for Varroa and understand what it means. Get to the training, manage Varroa levels as you would any other pest in the colony to an appropriate amount to make sure your bees continue to do what you want them to do.
So give me an example of what that looks like. What do they, if you find Varroa, what should a beekeeper do to keep the levels low and manageable?
Yeah, so beekeepers need to be clear about what time of the year and what the colony phase is like at the time they find Varroa. And depending on the number of mites that they find in their alcohol wash. So an alcohol wash is a sample of 300 bees from a colony, and depending on the amount of Varroa found in that particular sample and across the apiary, so encouraging beekeepers to wash as many hives as possible at every apiary and getting a good understanding of what the infestation rate would be. And looking through the current information of the transition to management resources to understand what level they're at and what they need to do to implement an IPM strategy. So an integrated pest management approach is the best way of combating the negative effects that will happen to your colony once you do have Varroa reproducing inside the brood box.
And so the way we talk about it, this all sounds large-scale commercial, but this is also targeting, your hobbyists as well, isn't it?
That's right. Everybody who has a European honeybee hive, to absolutely be sure about what's going on inside that colony. And even before Varroa, this is a really important part of our code of practice as an industry nationally, to really understand what's happening in the colony and what you need to do as the person in charge of that hive to manage that effectively.
And have you noticed much change in the way beekeepers are managing their hives? Is there like a clear before and after of habits and techniques?
Yeah, definitely. There's a few things. Certainly looking in your colonies a lot more frequently. We had, I suppose now I've been living with Varroa for what feels like 3 years of the response, but certainly have had colonies now for over 12 months and had the first season under my belt of having bees with Varroa in them. It does change the frequency that you need to look in those colonies and have a good inspection of the brood frames to understand what's happening. all of our other previous pests and diseases are still there that are risk to us. So we ought to make sure we know what we're looking for. And the symptoms of Varroa, they can really spike quite quickly. So it's about frequency and going back into hives. And we've changed from maybe looking in our colonies at a minimum of about 2 months apart, but now we're talking every 4 to 5 weeks, looking for Varroa levels, understanding what's happening in the colony.
And that's all quite an impost on time and labour and resources too for the beekeeper, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're looking about 30% more cost to the beekeeper.
Daryl Brenton, who was also coping with increasing family commitments, made the choice to decrease the number of his hives in order to cope with the increased workload.
When Varroa might turn up, it was basically double your work staff or halve your number of bees. So your workload was going to be bigger. So you either needed more staff to help with that, or if you weren't prepared to put extra people on, you've got to run less bees.
And you've gone down that the second track. So you actually rationalised your number of hives quite substantially during that period. How many hives did you lose overall?
I did. I had 120 that were forcibly. When I say forcibly, that was the process. So 120 were required and were euthanised. But I had around another 600 or 700, I think it was. Might be a little bit less than that I handed over. So you basically now got to buy treatments and do that physical work just to keep those bees alive, to reduce the mite numbers in the colony, and so that they're not at a damaging threshold of population of mites in a beehive. So prior to that, prior to the mite turning up, you just had to make sure they were happy and healthy, had a new queen, didn't have a few of the diseases that bees do succumb to, and bees are right. You look after them, move them around. They got honey and look after you. So now every single hive needs some intervention a couple of times a year to keep that hive alive.
And while individual beekeepers are now keeping a closer eye than ever on their hives, AgriFutures and the T2M program have moved to capture those insights so that industry as a whole can keep track of the situation at a national level. They're using the Colony Loss Survey system, known amongst industry as the Col Loss survey for short. These Col Loss surveys are already in place in countries all around the world, where just like Australia, they commenced as a result of the arrival of Varroa.
So this colony loss survey is part of a management initiative through the National Varroa Transition to Management program to basically get an idea of what beekeepers' experiences with Varroa and other factors that affect colony losses every year have been. So we launched this survey at the start of the year, asking questions about the previous year's production season. We sent this survey to, it was open to all beekeepers in Australia, basically asking them what their biggest issues throughout the year were. So what caused, how many colonies did they lose throughout that year, and what were the primary causes of colony losses?
Some 1,063 beekeepers from all across Australia took part in the survey, ranging from large commercial beekeepers right down to backyard hobbyists.
Even though Varroa is, for the most part at the moment, confined to New South Wales, it is a nationwide survey because we need this information from everyone.
Because it's not just about Varroa, it paints a broader picture about the health of the hives nationally, doesn't it? So what sort of things did you discover about the health of Australia's hives, and how does that compare to other countries as well?
Yeah, so for the most part, we found that Australian honeybees are actually really healthy. So overall, over all the responses we received from around the country, we worked out that our annual colony loss rate is about 1.5%. So that's 1.5% of all managed colonies that are lost throughout the year for one reason or another. And that's actually really low throughout compared to other countries around the world. So one of the lowest in the world. So if you compare that to, say, New Zealand, they lose about 10% of their colonies every year, according to their survey. Most countries throughout Europe are usually between 10 and 20%. The US, by contrast, loses a lot more, 30 to 40% of their hives every year. The only other countries that were kind of comparable to the rates that we showed, I think, were Israel and Norway. And these are all based on other surveys similar to ours that are run around the world. But their colony loss rates were around 2 to 3%. So we're even beating them, which is good.
And so when you look across the nation, was there much difference from state to state, and in particular those states where Varroa has already arrived?
We found kind of varying data from different states showing different primary reasons for colony losses in different states. But what we did find was where Varroa is present, which currently is largely confined to New South Wales, we did find that Varroa is one of the leading causes of colony losses in New South Wales already.
But the survey wasn't just about Varroa mite. The survey also captured data on other pests and diseases to inform better response strategies at the national level.
It details from a beekeeper's perspective what's been happening in their colony losses throughout the year. That collection of information is really so important in understanding and helping advocate for industry in the future about what's causing most of the losses.
In analysing the data gathered by the Col Loss survey, Michael Holmes found signs of new challenges ahead.
And another really interesting thing that we found was that, so in New South Wales, one of the major pests is also small hive beetle, which is throughout the eastern states of New South Wales. It's also an introduced species. And we did find that in areas where there is both Varroa and small hive beetle, the losses due to small hive beetle were higher than in places where there is no Varroa.
So it's actually revealing a bunch of whole new questions, as well as trying to identify hotspots in Varroa.
Well, that's exactly right. And that was kind of one of the reasons we did this survey was as well as Varroa being an issue, and we know Varroa is an issue, we wanted to be able to identify other issues for beekeepers all over the country, not just to do with Varroa. Just to give us an idea of what the major issues, big trends, things on the horizon that we aren't necessarily at the forefront of our minds just yet, but to be aware of that these are things that we need to be worried about and think about.
Bianca Jiggins says one of the major issues revealed by the Col Loss survey was the impact of environmental conditions on hive health across the board.
I think the other thing that's been really surprising is starvation was listed as one of the key colony losses across the country in many states. So that was a really interesting factor. And as we know, honey production is a great measure of the health of our industry as a whole. And when we're listing starvation, we're talking about access to resources. We're talking about the floral abundance of the environment. So a really key component of healthy beekeeping and a healthy bee industry. So those things are really interesting. And if we can gather more across both commercial and recreational hobbyist beekeepers, more of that information is going to provide a bigger and better picture down the track.
The starvation question is an interesting one because, like I said, it's an indicator of a bigger thing. I mean, any thoughts on what might be going on there? Is it a matter of the drought in southern Australia, or what else could be driving that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think factors like droughts, we've had some severe droughts for the southern half of the country. So lots of South Australia and Victoria were in drought for a lot of 2024-25 season. The other factor, I suppose, as well is just access to floral resources. So sometimes different states can have, ARBIC advocates for beekeepers to have good access to floral resources, but generally we do have an up and down with government agencies, state forests, national parks. So access to getting to different sites is a common thing that beekeepers, as part of their business, really need to access some of those areas. And oftentimes in a drought, the areas that we do have access to are not flowering because of that drought event. And it means that, we have, an overall loss of floral resource for pollinators in general across the world, and Australia is no different. So we have had, we build new cities, new towns, housing developments. We knock down trees, and the older trees in the environment produce some of the best honey at the age they get to. So we do have some of those factors creeping into my thought process about what that starvation answer could mean. But certainly drought beekeepers are at the forefront of the loss of some of our honey production just due to really major drought events. And we've had more of them in the more recent times. Not only drought, I should remember, fires, fires across our 19 and 20 bushfires really did decimate a lot of the country that beekeepers were utilising, and takes decades for some of those at that catastrophic fire event to really replenish in the bush. So we may have more of those types of issues in the future for those particular areas.
Does it get to the point where industry talks about or contemplates the notion of catastrophic hive loss? What does that mean and what does that look like?
Yeah, well, luckily here, I think the results we've had before Col Loss that are not so much nationally understood, and I guess we haven't had a questionnaire or a survey in this depth before, but what we know about Col Loss overseas versus Australia is quite a big difference in percentage of hive losses for Australian beekeepers, as low as 2 to 5% loss, which is worldwide. Like, that's amazing that we've not had Varroa as long as anybody else. And the hive losses for somewhere like New Zealand or the US, respectively, you're looking at maybe 15 to 20% loss in NZ. And sometimes up to a 45% loss of colonies annually for the US. And those are what they consider normal. And when
Wow.
you compare
That's
the
brutal.
difference of our, before Varroa losses, it's quite remarkable. We really did have the best beekeeping experiences, I think, in the globe. But what I would consider as catastrophic would be what the US have experienced. And the Col Loss survey has captured some of that last year. They've had about a 70% colony loss. Now, that drives people to figure out what happened. It drives a lot of questions further after that. And it has provided the beekeeping industry in the US with a process with which to follow up and look into different things like viruses or pesticides or whatever it might have been. And so it kind of sparks that further investigation option. And because 70% losses over the whole of the US does seem quite catastrophic.
If Australia did experience a colony loss at that catastrophic scale, what does that look like for the rest of agriculture? I mean, is that the almond industry goodbye? Or give this some context for the rest of agriculture, because we often take it for granted that bees operate over here and crops operate over there and horticulture's over there.
Yeah,
But it's a very interconnected system, isn't it?
absolutely. Look, food wouldn't be food without bees. So yeah, a third of the food we consume is attributed to honeybee pollination, and not just any bees, European honeybees. So we really do underpin food security. What I think people need to remember when we understand the spread of Varroa across our environmental landscape, it will take the majority, like we're talking 99% of the feral colonies from the landscape, they'll be gone because Varroa will wipe them out. Now, if you think about food production zones and areas across Australia, losing those feral bees will impact the crops that might be dependent at some rate. Even if it's a 30% dependency, the loss of the feral colonies will impact those growers. And what will happen is we'll have to really bunker down and look at where beekeepers are, how many colonies they've got, what is the availability of colonies at the times when certain agricultural and food crops will need our service, and making sure that the future looks positive if we're moving forward together with mutual understanding of keeping bees healthy on farm and making sure that crops produce a yield that is a profit still for those growers.
And while the Col Loss survey is now keeping the industry ahead of emerging challenges, Daryl Brenton still believes there's a period of adjustment ahead for beekeepers on the ground as Varroa continues its spread.
There's definitely been some beekeepers in Kempsey that don't have any hives anymore, so they've stepped out of the industry, and they may not return. There's others like myself that have downsized, and there's others that haven't. So I think behind all of that is everyone's individual circumstances. So some may expand, some may not, but it will definitely, I think the pollination dependent industries, need to take a look at what's happening in the bee industry. If beekeepers do end up doing a bit more pollination, it might become a different income stream. So it might actually, help beekeepers that when they just traditionally relied on honey production, if you've also got opportunities for pollination, it might actually strengthen businesses in the future.
The AgriFutures 2025 Colony Loss Survey will be launched in September. So anyone who's a beekeeper, large or small, commercial or private, hobbyist or professional, please do your bit and become one of the people changing Australian agriculture by filling out the form and providing details of the health of your hives to AgriFutures to help better guide the future of the beekeeping sector. It's important not just for your bees, but also for the crops that depend on them for pollination. All you need to do is fill out the form online at colloss.au, that's COLOSS.au. Right, that brings us to the end of this episode and our exploration of Australia's honeybees and their crucial role for Australian agriculture. If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating on your podcast platform. This helps us spread the word to more people about the amazing farmers, scientists, researchers and big characters who are changing the face of Australian agriculture for the better. Next time on Unearthed, we're doing something very, very special. We're embarking on our very first multi-part series called The Long Game. We're going back in time to track the impact of one of AgriFutures' most transformational initiatives, that of the Rural Women's Award. This year, the award is celebrating its 25th anniversary. That's a hell of an achievement. Well done to everyone involved and happy birthday. But it may never have even got off the ground if it wasn't for an ABC reporter, a shed meeting in rural Queensland, and an invisible lady who was simultaneously chairing that meeting while serving cups of tea to all of the delegates. It sparked a chain reaction that led to the formation of the Rural Women's Ward and a transformation in the culture of rural Australia. I'll tell you all about it in our next episode of Unearthed, the people changing Australian agriculture, a podcast brought to you by AgriFutures Australia.